A very warm welcome to you all, girls. Good morning. Hope you're all doing great today. So, today, girls, we are going to start with chapter 3, Liberalisation, Privatisation, and Globalisation. In short, this is called as LPG. So, you should be very thorough with all these concepts. So, before getting into the understanding of what is liberalization, privatization, and globalization, we have to look into the introduction of before all these concepts or reforms of LPG. Let us see the introduction and the background behind these. Okay, so introduction. In 1991, India met with an economic crisis relating to its external debt. The government was not able to make repayments on its borrowings from abroad. So, foreign exchange reserves, which were generally maintained to import petrol and other important items, dropped to the levels that were not sufficient for even a fortnight. So, as I've spoken to you in the previous class, that during the import substitution policy, what was the impact? The impact was to cut down the imports and to encourage the domestic production, isn't it? So, when that was a policy, there were certain areas where imports were made. So, when the imports were made, we had to pay in dollars or in any other foreign currencies. So, when this became in excess, when we were unable to reach the or pay the uh, foreign currency, we had to do the borrowings from the foreign financial institutions. So we became debtors. So we started to borrow money in loan, and our foreign reserves were all empty. What else? We our everything started to decline. So, whatever we had, it was not at all sufficient even for a little while. Every time we borrow money from a different country or a foreign currency, whatever we borrow from a different nation, it was sufficient for a particular period. And again, it's empty. Again, we need to borrow. There was a reason for this. What was the reason? The reason was there was no revenue generated from the industries of our country. What was the reason behind it? So the crisis was further compounded. It started to increase by rising prices of essential goods, which led the government to introduce a set of policy measures which changed the direction of our developmental strategy. So, this crisis of what was the crisis? The crisis of finance. It started to increase because there were increase in price of essential goods. Imagine essential goods being food, clothing, such simple goods. They were so expensive, and our population were so incapable of affording. They couldn't afford to buy even essential goods. That was the situation. So why was the reason? Because they cut down the import trade, and the domestic trade was encouraged, but the traders, they started to increase the prices in the production, in the sales. Ultimately, it affected the entire economy. Moving on to the next slide. So let us see the background. The origin of financial crisis can be traced from the inefficient management of Indian economy in the 1980s. So, as we all have understood, there was the downfall of the Indian economy during the year 1980 due to inefficient management. they didn't manage well. The trade policies which were framed were not that apt. It was not suitable for the developing economy like India. And they just wanted to grow instantly, which was not helpful for the entire economy but benefited only certain sectors, which was not good again. So, this became a huge burden on the economy. So it was also known that implementing various policies and its general administration, the government generates funds from various sources such as taxation, running of public sector enterprises, etc. So, government, as you all know, they generate revenue from various sources. As I've already spoken, taxation, tax on what? Tax on all the import of goods. So, whichever goods that comes to our country has to be, it is the tax has been added to it, and that's why all the imported goods are expensive. And running of public sector enterprises. Public sector enterprises always produces in large number, and those products are being supplied to different countries, and that's how the revenue is generated. So when the expenditure is more than income, the government borrows to finance the deficit from banks and also from people within the country and from international financial institutions. So, girls, when you earn 100 rupees, how much do you expend or how much do you spend? You spend either half of it or you make sure that you save some, isn't it? You save and then you spend the remaining, or you do 1 is to 1, isn't it? Wherein here, during the particular period, what happened? India was spending more than generating the income. So the government had to borrow more and more finance from different financial sectors of the same country, or a foreign financial investors, or international foreign financial institutions. So this became, again, India is borrowing finance from different countries. It became a habit to India, being indebtedness. Okay. Repayment of whatever they borrowed was a huge burden again. So this was impossible for them until and unless they had to stabilize in the production and manufacturing of the industrial sectors. So development policies required that even though the revenues were very low, the government had to overshoot its revenue to meet challenges like unemployment, poverty, and population explosion. So unemployment started. There were people without jobs. So without jobs, then they have no incomes. No incomes, then there's no proper food, no shelter, poverty. All this started to impact on the economic growth, and there were more number of population, growth in birth rate. So this drastically brought down the economic development. The continued spending on development programs of the government did not generate additional revenue. So, there were various developmental programs which were introduced by the government which had no revenue at all. Simply, they had to spend on it, and just for the heck of running the show, they had to move on. So, the government was not able to generate sufficiently from internal sources such as taxation. Now, internal sources as taxation indicates that people were suffering from unemployment. When there is unemployment, how will they even generate money to pay the tax? So this became a major issue. It had to subside, which it did not. The income from public sector undertakings was also not very high to meet the growing expenditure. So the public sector also started to have a low income, or revenue generation was less, At the times our foreign exchange borrowed from other countries and international financial institutions was spent only for meeting consumption needs. So whatever the money was borrowed from foreign institutions were just spent on the consumption, whatever they had to produce just to consume. It was not even spent on repaying the loans or anything. So, to feed the people, the population of India, the sufficiency of the money was not fine. So, in the late 1980s, government expenditure began to exceed its revenue by such large margins that meeting the expenditure through borrowings became unsustainable. So, government expenditure it started to exceed the revenue. As we have already discussed, we should always spend less what we earn. We cannot spend more than what we earn, isn't it? What is the whole point in earning then? So that was exceeding. The expenditure was exceeding than the revenue, and it became unsustainable. India couldn't bear the expenditures. Prices of many essential goods rose up. So, because of the high indebtedness or unsustainable borrowings, what the economy or the policymakers did, they started to shoot up the prices of the domestic goods that is being produced for the consumption of the Indian population. So imports grew at very high rate without matching the growth of exports. So imports were more than exports. So girls, you need to understand, if you keep taking things from others and when you're not giving enough, what will happen? When you take things, you'll have to pay them, right? So from your pocket you're paying more, and from outside, what are you getting? You're getting less. So the balance of payment was not at all there. There was also no sufficient foreign exchange to pay the interest that needs to be paid to the international lenders. So the foreign exchange reserves, what we keep, what the government had to keep, also didn't have sufficient balance. India approached the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, that is IBRD, popularly known as World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and received $7 billion as loan to manage the crisis. Imagine girls, 7 million. So this was provided by IMF, IBRD. IBRD is nothing but the World Bank. So they were provided by these huge banks of it belonged to international companies. So they provided this large amount to India to shut down the crisis, to solve the problems of finance. Do you think all this helped India to really rectify, or did it help the help to solve the expenditure? It did not help, but still they were to an extent it was helpful because they were encouraged employment. So, for availing the loan, these international agencies expected India to liberalize and open up the economy by removing restrictions on the private sector, reduce the role of government in many areas, and remove trade restrictions between India and other countries. So IBRD and IMF came into picture not to do any kind of charity job. So they just lend the money. Yeah, of course, India has to repay back to IBRD and IMF. It is not free of cost, whatever they're lending the money. But they lend the money with an intention and with a condition. What was the condition? Condition being they had to relax certain rules and regulations on private sectors. So they wanted the private sector companies to grow in the Indian economy. So that is the time when there were a lot of private sectors introduced in our country. So government also thought, what will happen if we liberalize the private sectors? So they thought they could be a good employment number. There could be encouragement in what to say environmental growth, the environmental structure, the economic structure also can grow. So there were various things, thought process that happened during this particular uh, discussion. So now, with all this IBRD and IMF coming into picture, there was introduction of NEP. Now, girls, what is NEP? India agreed to the conditionality of World Bank. So they ultimately agreed. Indians agreed to the conditions of World Bank and IMF and announced the new economic policy. NEP stands for New Economic Policy. So they introduced a new economic policy which were in favor of private sectors. So the NEP consisted of wide-ranging economic reforms. The thrust of the policies was towards creating a more competitive environment in the economy and moving the barriers to entry and growth of firms. Understood? So the barriers for entry is and foreign companies coming into our country and having the establishment in our country. So that is the private sector. It is nowhere related to our country. The other country people coming into our country and starting their business or functioning their operations. So this set of policies can broadly be classified into two groups. The stabilization measures, the structural reform measures. So now we should understand what do you mean by stabilization and structural measures. So the stabilization measures are short term measures intended to correct some of the weaknesses that have developed in the balance of payments. So when is the weakness of balance of payments? So basically balance of payments means all money flowing into the country in a particular period of time and the outflow of money to the rest of the world. Understood? So it is the import and the export. If the number of imports you are doing is equal to the number of export you are doing, there exists a balance of payment. So whatever, if it is always said that number of exports should be more than number of imports, then is when your value of rupee will be high. So here you can understand India's balance of payment was low because of this, and that was a weakness. So that was the stabilization measures taken by NEP, the new economic policy. Understood? So the next was the structural reform. So here after the balance of payment and to bring inflation. So girls, what do you mean by inflation? Inflation is rise in prices of most goods and services of daily or a common use such as food, clothing, etc. So there were inflation because of import substitution, right? Inflation in the sense domestic product production was more, and because they couldn't repay the debts, they had to increase the prices of whatever products they were produced, and population of India were forced to buy the same products which were highly priced. All right. So that is about stabilization. Then coming to on the other hand, the structural reform policies are long-term measures. This is for a longer period. So this aimed at improving the efficiency of economy and increasing its international competitiveness by removing the rigidities in various segments of Indian economy. So international competitiveness where the encouraging the foreign companies or the encouraging the actual domestic industries and saving from the foreign competitors. So these were the rigidities in various segments of Indian economy. So they had to remove certain policies. And the government initiated a variety of policies which fall under three heads. Okay, so what were they? So these policies were set up to correct some of the weaknesses that have developed in the balance of payments and to bring inflation under control. So girls, I would also like to mention during this particular period, the Prime Minister was P.V. Narasimha Rao and the Finance Minister was Manmohan Singh. With the help of the Financial Minister, our Prime Minister, he gave the way to the growth of the new policies for the better economy. All right. So, with this, the main features of NEP being the introduction of three main new reforms. So, they were liberalization, privatization, and globalization. So, today we are going to stop over here and let me see, girls. I've asked you a question. I want you people to quickly answer and please send me your attendance in the attendance group which we have individually created. Okay, so I will complete over here, girls. The next class we're going to start with liberalization. We shall see the meaning and we shall see the various sectors where the liberalization had its effect and impact. Okay, so far any doubts you just let me know. I will sort out your doubts. All right, girls, take care and please keep your classwork completed. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.